Hello, Starshine. My name is Liz, and this is my channel, Simsational Stories. If you have not seen my videos before and you enjoy this one, please like and subscribe. And maybe check out my Facebook page, where this whole thing began, as well. All relevant links are in the description below, and of course, if you're a Sims player and you'd like to download any of the characters featured in my stories, just search the hashtag Simsational Stories on the Sims 4 gallery. All original content is created by This Is Not Eric. Alrighty then. So, welcome. And what is up, Buttercup? Are you having a good day or a bad day? Whichever your answer, please allow me to distract you from your life and tell you a story, a Simsational story. Before I begin though, I'd like to issue this blanket content and trigger warning. The following story is just Sims, hey. I'm not going to apologise for treating them terribly, if that's what I've done. But I do want to assure you now that although I mean absolutely no harm, I completely understand if you feel unable to consume my content. Many loves, and we will catch each other on the internet elsewhere. Okay, so now we've gotten that over with, let's go. Today's story is from Over to Oberon, and we're at chapter 1. All subsequent chapters will be put into a playlist on my channel, where you can hear the entire story in chronological order. So without further ado, let me introduce, or reintroduce, you to Oberon down. Oberon's father Magnus had been a scientist. Had been. Well, he still was. One never really stops being a scientist, he told his children, because the world never really stops showing us new things. And Magnus had surely lived a life that proved that to be true. Why, Magnus had a whole story of his own to tell. For many years ago, when he had been young, just a lowly lab technician fresh out of high school, beginning his long career as a scientist, Magnus had been abducted by aliens. He had been having a rather boring Saturday night, actually, until quite suddenly he felt the irresistible urge to walk outside, and the next thing he knew, he was floating above his own house, disappearing into a spaceship. It was wild, unimaginable, and utterly unbelievable, but all completely and utterly true too. Magnus Down had been abducted by aliens, and not only that, but after he had been deposited back down on Earth, he was to find out that he was pregnant. He, a man, was pregnant with their genetic gift unto him. When Magnus told his girlfriend at the time, Ashley Bermudez, about the situation, she was not excited about it, to say the least. She didn't even believe him until Magnus showed her proof in the form of an ultrasound, and even then she'd tried to convince him to get rid of it somehow. She didn't support the idea of crossbreeding and worried that whatever was growing inside Magnus could be dangerous. Of course, baby Oberon wasn't dangerous at all. He was just like any other baby, for the most part. If you ignored his translucent blue skin, his coal black eyes that stared at you with superhuman intelligence and, just everything. Ashley still thought it was unnatural. The way it cried, it wasn't like a normal baby at all, and nothing Magnus said could convince her otherwise. They had been engaged, but in the end, Ashley ended up leaving Magnus at the altar. She tried, right up until the very last minute, to pretend, even to herself, that she could do it. But as she had walked down the aisle, listening to that unholy, echoing gurgle override all else, Ashley had balked. Magnus had been blindsided and broken-hearted. He'd had no idea his love felt this way until she'd suddenly screamed that everything had to stop. She couldn't do this. And then she'd left. Ashley's brother had come by the next week to pick up her things. Left alone with his newborn alien son, at first Magnus didn't really know what to do. All he knew was that he was glad Ashley was gone. If she couldn't love Oberon, then he couldn't love her. His son was his whole weird world, and even though he had no idea what he was doing as a parent, he knew he would never give up on his son like she had given up on him. Magnus had been working on his very own rocket ship all throughout his pregnancy, and originally he'd wanted to surprise Ashley with a space honeymoon. But now he had another idea. He was going to go looking to find Oberon's family and find out whether maybe they wanted his son. It was a wildly adventurous idea, and he was terrified in so many ways to leave his son behind. But he had to know. He had to at least find some answers. He owed his son that much, at least. Magnus never denied an element of ego was required to reach 6M that first time. There were a lot of rocket scientists in the world, but he, Magnus Down, was the first and only one who had ever made it through that wormhole alive, and then back home to tell the tale of his trip afterwards. He took as many samples as he could, as well as clippings and seeds for his garden back home, before setting off to explore and maybe find someone. And find someone he did. Kilarya Nimero was at the time actually a trainee pollination technician, and she was just walking home and happened upon Magnus. 6am protocol was clear. Kilarya was supposed to overpower Magnus, wipe his memory, and send him back home. But Kilarya had always been curious about the other side of her work, and felt like she couldn't miss out on this chance to ask this human some questions. She could always wipe his brain later. As she listened to Magnus's story of abduction, mysterious genetically impossible pregnancy, painful C-section birth, and looked at the pictures he showed her, Kilarya could see the love he now held for his baby son, and she was amazed by it. On 6am, babies were grown in artificial pods, nurtured by robots as children, and then placed into gender-specific creches in their teens. Life was very regimented and artificial. Nothing like Earth. Kilarya broke a million more protocols then, as she helped Magnus escape from 6am and came down to Earth to meet his son Oberon. Kilarya had never seen a baby before. The pollination mission, she was sad to inform Magnus, was merely an evolutionary failsafe her planet employed to ensure that their race would never die out. They didn't want the offspring from it back, and if either she or Magnus returned to their planet, they would wipe his memory and imprison her. It was lucky for Kilarya, then, that she had fallen in love with Magnus, and was happy to stay. Kilarya made peace with her new life rather quickly, actually. She had always felt slightly out of place on 6am, but here on Earth it was different. She was different. It was almost like she was where she was meant to be. A huge part of it was baby Oberon. Motherhood was something as alien to Kilarya as she was to Earth itself. And yet, somehow, it all came so naturally to her. Oberon was definitely not her genetic offspring. She had only ever assisted in abductions, never fertilized anyone herself. But somehow, he still felt like her son. She felt such a strong connection to him, and she couldn't imagine that his real mother could ever love him more than she did. And Oberon loved her back. As far as he knew, she really was his mother. She had always been there, as long as he could remember, and she was special, just like him. For even at a young age, Oberon's alien powers were beginning to manifest. He first morphed into a human shell at 18 months old, and he was empathizing with his father long before that. They weren't sure he hadn't been doing that his whole life. As he grew up, Oberon learnt that they were supposed to morph into their human shells when they left the house. For him it was a fun game, but for his parents it was far more serious than that. Even though Magnus was a rocket scientist who worked for the government, he'd never told them about his alien adventures, and he was afraid of what would happen to his family if they found out. None of that registered with Oberon, though. He was only a little kid. And while he was still small, his parents were very careful about the kind of language they used to talk about it with him. It was just a game. How long could he do it for? Could he hold his human form for a whole trip to the supermarket? If he could, then maybe he'd get a treat. It was during this time that Kelalia discovered and began to investigate the Strangerville mystery, a story all of its own. Despite being a scientist, Magnus had grown up in Strangerville, and so had always taken the mysterious plants for granted. But Kelalia? She had visited all over Earth, and she'd never seen anything like that plant anywhere else. It took Kelalia many months to get to the bottom of what was going on in Strangerville. At one stage, she even got possessed herself. The mysterious plants were all over the town, growing and pulsating with menace as they slowly took over. Kelalia pretended to be a scientist herself to gain access to a governmental secret lab, and found within it a giant mother plant, huge and hungry. The thing tried to kill her. Heck, it very nearly did kill her if she was telling the truth. She'd only just barely ducked that tentacle. Was it a tentacle, though? Or a tendril? A vine? Some sort of arm? What was the Great Mother Plant anyway? And what had she wanted from the people of Strangerville? Oberon was too little at the time to really understand or remember. That was Kalalia's story, not his. And at that stage, he'd been far more focused on some other news his father had told him. Kalalia was pregnant and going to have a baby. They didn't know if it would be a boy or a girl yet, or maybe a lizard, Oberon joked, since she was an alien like him. But Kalalia had secretly known for weeks now. She'd wanted to defeat the Great Mother Plant before telling Magnus, in case he tried to stop her. Oberon's birthday fell at this crucial in-between time in their life, too. He was growing up, as children are wont to do, and his parents were excited to see who he would become as the years went on. Already he was so like his father in attitude and interests, and yet he shared many aspects with his alien mother, too. He was not genetically a mix of them as their own child would be, but if you didn't know that, you never would have guessed it. Oberon's parents decided to get married before the baby came. Magnus even chose to take his wife's last name, Nimue, leaving Oberon with his own last name, Down, which was a little unconventional. But what about their life was conventional? The only normal thing that Magnus and Kalalia Nimue had ever done was their family life. Together they raised Oberon with love, and they were so excited to be adding another little life to their lot. Oberon was also super excited about the possibility of a little brother or sister because, well, he was honestly just interested in the mechanics of it all. He knew now that he wasn't really Kalalia's son, but this baby would definitely be hers, right? So, what would happen? Would the baby come out alien, like him? Or human, like his dad? Or some kind of a weird mix between the two? And that brings us to the end of Chapter 1 of Over to Oberon. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can tune in soon to hear the next chapter. Or like I said, look us up on Facebook. Bye!